I think we've got 16 or 17 members who are going to talk. The leader is one of them, and we'll let him talk when he gets here. Anytime a new airline executive comes to see me, I say there are two things that every member of Congress thinks they're an expert on. One is elections and one is air travel. And so you're going to hear a lot this week from a lot of experts, particularly I think our friends on the other side are going to be talking about bills that I believe that they have generally not looked at, haven't read, have decided that somehow state legislatures are universally committed to voter suppression. Voter suppression, really, I've never seen that public voter suppression as a very good political tactic. And I would say, looking at these bills carefully, what I think you'll find, and I look forward to the exceptions you might come up with that I haven't come up with, is that state after state leaned forward, as you would hope they would in the pandemic, and added some additional voting things that they had never had before. And in virtually every case, and again, I haven't found an exception, there may be one, but it would be the exception that proves the rule. In virtually every case, when that election was over, they looked at what they had done and said, how much of that should we keep? And I think state after state have changed their laws in a way that it will be easier to vote going forward than it was to vote in 2018. My mother used to say, no good deed goes unpunished. And what we don't want to do here, though we may have already done it, is teach the lesson, if you try to adjust to a momentary challenge, when you try to dial that back, everybody will assume that you're trying to do bad things instead of trying to save the best of the things that you try to do. And whether that's voting by mail or drop boxes or days of early voting, I think you're going to find that the bills they're going to be talking about this week generally have more of all of those than states like New York and Delaware and Connecticut, and we look forward to talking about that. Also want to remember that the basic framework for the big election bills, whether it's the John Lewis Act or whatever the name is of the other bill that is hundreds of pages, the basis for that is H.R. 1, which in fact passed the year before the 2020 elections were over, and suddenly it's the 2020 elections, why you have to change the election law for everything Democrats have always wanted to do in ways that they've always believed give them advantages in the whole election process. And so we're going to be talking about that this week on the floor. There'll be time for questions, and I'll be here for questions, and others will that choose to stay when members have had a chance to talk. But we're going to start with Mr. Brasso and then Mr. Langford, and there's a list right here that you all will follow.
Well, the Democrats this week are focused on what they consider the #1 priority for them. That's why they labeled the bill S1, H.R. 1. It is the Democrats' #1 priority, and they are wanting to rig the rules of the Senate to get it passed. Now, that doesn't mean it's the #1 priority of the American people. People across the country are concerned about things like inflation and COVID and crime in the cities and the crisis at the southern border. But for the Democrats, they think the #1 thing affecting the country is they want Washington to take over elections in the United States. So what really is the most important questions? Well, Gallup had a recent poll on this. And what Gallup says is the #1 issue is economy, poor leadership at the federal level, COVID, immigration, and this issue of election reform, that came in at number 23. It was only an asterisk in the Gallup poll as an issue of concern for the American people, when the American people know what's of concern to them. So Senator Blunt mentioned local election officials. I've heard from our Secretary of State, Ed Buchanan, And let me just share a few of the things that he says about elections. And he says, number one, I'm writing to oppose and express my opposition to the Democrats' attempt to federalize our elections. He goes on and says, Senator Schumer's statements are offensive on their face, suggesting that Republican-led state legislators pass laws designed for the purpose of voter suppression, he says, is slanderous and is a political lie to the American people. He said, interestingly, in Senator Schumer's home state of New York, they are moving forward in some jurisdictions with plans to allow non-citizens to vote. Based on this, he says, it is clear that Democrats want to change the rules whenever they think they can gain an advantage at the polls. He goes on, this is right in line with their wish to change the filibuster rules in the U.S. Senate. Because the Democrat agenda does not resonate with everyday working Americans, they must resort to less than honorable tactics. They do not seem to understand that it is their misguided policies, giving catalyst to rising energy and food costs, that are their biggest impediments to election, not Republican state legislatures that want to protect election integrity. And to me, that's what it's about: ballot integrity, ballot accountability, ballot security, and that's what we're here fighting to defend.
Well, in the past 6 years, Democrats in the Senate have filibustered bills and nominations 589 times. In the past 6 years, 589 times. Now, less than 1 year into the Biden presidency, they've suddenly declared that the filibuster is unfair and it's overused. So they're planning to remake the Senate in their own image, where the voice of the minority is no longer heard and no longer respected. That's the plan for the Democrats. Stop allowing the minority voice to be heard. To be clear, the debate this week is not about voting rights. Federal courts already have the full ability to stay any law in any jurisdiction in any state in America that suppresses any voter or any group of voters. That's in federal law right now. This whole conversation about voter suppression is already protected by federal courts right now. The debate this week that Senator Schumer is bringing is about silencing the voice of the minority in the Senate and everyone that we represent, literally silencing half the country. This is not about protecting our republic or our election. This is about Democrats in Washington taking over every election in every state. This is about Senator Schumer's power. That's what this is all about. He's willing to destroy more than 2 centuries of tradition in the Senate to get his way. That's not my opinion. Actually, that's Senator Schumer's opinion. Senator Schumer, just a few years ago, stood on the floor of the Senate and said, I hope the Republican leader and I can, in the coming months, find a way to build a firewall around the legislative filibuster, which is the most important distinction between the Senate and the House. Senator Schumer continued saying this: without the 60-vote threshold for legislation, the Senate becomes a majoritarian institution like the House, much more subject to the whims of short-term electoral change. No senator would like to see that happen. So let's find a way to protect the 60-vote rule for legislation. I agree with that, Senator Schumer. I also agree with Dick Durbin. When in 2018, Dick Durbin was asked about the legislative filibuster, and he said, I would tell you it would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised and created, going back to our founding fathers. I also agree with the 27 other Democrat senators that wrote a letter to Mitch McConnell and to Senator Schumer in 2017 asking for there to be no changes in the legislative filibuster. In that letter, they wrote this: we're asking you to join us in opposing any effort to curtail the existing rights and prerogatives of senators to engage in full, robust, and extended debate as we consider legislation before this body and in the future. I would tell you they asked me to join them in opposing any effort to change the legislative filibuster. I agree. I will. And that is completely my plan to be able to do that. We will not allow them to silence half the country.
You're up, Ted.
Good morning. Chuck Schumer and the Democrats are desperate to break the Senate rules and try to engage in a corrupt power grab. this bill that they're pushing, the Corrupt Politicians Act, would undermine democracy across the country. It takes laws adopted by democratically elected legislatures and subjects them to the arbitrary veto of politically radical, unelected bureaucrats at the Department of Justice. President Biden has nominated hard-left ideologues to the Department of Justice, including two of the leading advocates of abolishing the police in the country. And what Chuck Schumer and the Democrats are proposing is putting those ideologues in charge of election laws across this country. What Schumer and the Democrats are trying to do is strike down every single voter ID law in the country, even though 80% of Americans support them, even though a large majority of African American voters support voter ID laws. Democrats have decided that voter fraud benefits them politically, and they're willing to go to any length to tear down the reasonable common sense protections that protect the integrity of our elections. They're willing to go so far as breaking the rules of the Senate to end the filibuster. Now, if you want to know the consequences of that, you may perhaps be skeptical of Republicans. If you're not a Republican, you may be from a different political view. So I want to point you to someone who's not a Republican, assessing the consequences of what Chuck Schumer is proposing right now. That person is a person by the name of Charles Schumer, who in 2005, March 16th, 2005, said about nuking the Senate rules and ending the filibuster. Here's what Chuck Schumer said. They want, because they can't get their way, to change the rules midstream, to wash away 200 years of history. They want to make this country into a banana republic where if you don't get your way, you change the rules. It'll be doomsday for democracy if we do. Chuck Schumer said ending the filibuster would be doomsday for democracy and turn America into a banana republic. He was telling the truth in 2005, and it's still true today.
Well, thank you all for being here today, and I want to thank all my colleagues. You can see by the number of people that are participating in this press conference today how passionately we feel about this. Anecdotally, I would like to say on the voting reform bill, in the state of West Virginia in the year 2020, we had more people voting in 2020 without this bill than we have had in the history of our state, with the exception of one election, and that was the 1960 election, where West Virginia was very pivotal in electing Senator John Kennedy to the presidency. Also, our Secretary of State has written, as Senator Barrasso said, in opposition to this, along with 54 of the 55 county clerks. That's 54. We have 55 counties. 54 of those clerks have written in opposition to this bill. I'm going to concentrate on three things here with the filibuster. First of all, the hypocrisy. I want to thank you, the press. I want to thank specifically the Washington Post, because I pulled up a montage this morning of the statements that Ted just referred to from Senator Schumer's, Senator Durbin, Senator Coons, and others, saying there's no way they would ever vote to break the filibuster. And here we are today with them eating their words. So that's hypocritical at the face of it. Supposedly, this is going to have more impact on bipartisanship. We're going to be bipartisan. I mean, seriously? We're going to be more bipartisan when you only need 50 or 50 votes with the Vice President breaking the tie to pass every piece of legislation? Why in the world, if you were the one sitting at 50 with the Vice President in your party, would you ever engage with the other party if you didn't want to? So that, to me, is a hollow argument, and that's one that the President himself has put forward as a reason that we should change the filibuster. I know you know I'm from the state of West Virginia, and I know you know that there is nobody that has served in this Senate besides Senator Robert Byrd, who knows the institution and traditions and has studied it more than anybody probably in the history of our Senate. He has said, I quote, and he's written prolifically on this subject, "I oppose cloture by a simple majority because I believe it would immediately destroy the uniqueness of this institution. Minority rights would cease to exist in the United States Senate. Quote, rule changes must be bipartisan, and we should, quote, jealously guard against efforts to change or reinterpret the Senate rules by a simple majority. So I would say to you today that the other charge that has been lodged against us as Republicans is, well, we would do this if we could. Well, guess what? We could have done this. I was on that letter that James talked about with the Democrat, the bipartisan letter that said, I'm not in favor of changing the filibuster rules when I was in the majority with the president in my same party. So I would say to you that this is more than just about one issue. This is about fundamentally changing the fabric, the fence that the Senate provides by having the filibuster in place to make sure that we don't have the dramatic swings from administration to administration, from majority to minority, Republican to Democrat, and that we keep the ship sort of going in the right direction and working together at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you for being here today. You've heard some of my colleagues reference a letter that Senator Collins and Senator Coons led several years ago. I was not on that letter, but I support the filibuster. So why wasn't I on the letter? Well, I wasn't on the letter because when I was first in the Senate, I watched the majority and the executive filibuster on judicial nominations. And I remembered what so many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle said during that debate, how we didn't need the filibuster. So I questioned their sincerity in signing on this letter at that point in time. I hate to say it, but I think my questions for them really proved to be true. As Senator Capito said, we had the opportunity to end the filibuster when we had the White House and the Senate, and we didn't do that. We kept our word on it. The people who signed that letter kept their word on it, the Republicans, but we didn't see that from our colleagues. I'd like to quote one of my colleagues because I agree with what she said. Because this is the Senate and not the House, in referencing not changing the filibuster, it's not just majority rule. There need to be more checks and balances. Things should take longer. There should be required consensus, which is one of the reasons that it is because of the 60-vote requirement that requires us to talk to each other, to be more attuned to other perspectives. I like that Mazie Hirono. I like her a lot. I have some issues with Mazie 2.0. Let's go back to things that we said, to things that we meant, to things that we know to be true. The minority has rights. The Senate protects those rights. A filibuster requires us to reach out across the aisle to get 60 votes, to find consensus. A filibuster protects the people of this country because we are not seeing swings from right to left, back to right, every time we have a president and a Senate in the same party. There's certainty, there's stability for the people of this country, for families to make decisions. When you have a tax policy that can be shifted, when you have foreign policy shifted, defense policy, health policy, social policy, when that can all be shifted on a 50-vote threshold, to be able to make those kind of changes by pushing things through, our country would be less secure. It would be less stable. It would be less certain. And that would, I believe, not only cause upheaval for the citizens of this country, but it would make our allies, our partners, also question just who we are as a country.
What the Democrats have coined as a voting rights bill is really just a partisan political power grab. It's a bill that would circumvent and federalize our entire federal elections process, stripping the states of their constitutional authorities. Senator Blunt referenced the fact that the claims that the states are somehow trying to suppress voter access to the polls are false. Idaho, as an example, is doing what Senator Blunt said the states across this country are doing, running their elections well and making sure that there is increased voter access and strengthened security at the polls. Idaho's implemented efforts to increase voter turnout, including same-day voter registration with proof of residence and no excuse absentee and early voting. Those are the kinds of things that are the truth that are happening around the country, not the claims about voter suppression. The Democrats' highly partisan power grab would force taxpayers to pay for politicians' political campaigns, expand the practice of ballot harvesting, keep deceased people and those who have moved out of the area on voter registration rolls, federalize our election laws, which would violate the U.S. Constitution's clear directive that states should administer elections. States are best equipped to implement and enforce election policies that protect the integrity and future of their elections. Efforts currently underway by our congressional Democrats to weaken the filibuster to achieve one-sided partisan policy will only further erode public confidence and trust in our election system. It is dangerous and will be catastrophic for the country. This is hardly a voting rights bill. Eliminating the filibuster in order to advance this bad legislation would only compound confusion and distrust of our election process.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And again, if you can look across the spectrum of all of our colleagues here, you can see that these are very important topics. One, the federalization or attempt to federalize our election system by the Democrats, as well as using that as a tool then to remove the Senate filibuster. One, I'm a former county auditor in Iowa, which serves as the local commissioner of elections. And I can tell you through Iowa's efforts through the years to update and modernize our elections laws has only created greater voter participation with every election. It is not an attempt to suppress the vote, and it goes directly against what Democrats are saying. Now, for the filibuster, for years, actually for decades, our Democratic colleagues have been strongly opposed to what we call blowing up the Senate, because that's in effect what it would do. And Chuck Schumer had said that if we get rid of that 60-vote requirement, it would be, quote, doomsday for democracy. Then Senator Joe Biden said the nuclear option, quote, is a fundamental power grab for the majority party. What has changed, folks? Fast forward to now, and these same Democratic leaders are the ones that are now singing a far different tune. And folks, that's exactly what I call the filibuster flip-flop, okay? So maybe we'll see Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden wearing a pair of these around the Senate floor or the White House. Okay, the filibuster flip-flop. So please tune in. Many of us will be speaking about this on the Senate floor as well. So for all of our friends here in the media, I mean, we've done the work for you. We have gone back, we've provided you with the quotes from our friends and colleagues across the aisle. You know, so what's going on right now that it's no longer a doomsday for democracy? Is it not a fundamental power grab any longer? I would love to see those headlines explaining their statements away. So you and I both know that nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is who's now in control, who's the majority party. So previous statements no longer apply. Again, the filibuster flip-flop. And if they do get their way, folks, we know that the Senate and our country will never be the same.
Thank you all for being here. I rise today to express my opposition to the Majority Leader's plan to change the Senate rules. It would open the door wide for filibuster to be eliminated for all legislation moving forward. The bottom line is very simple. The ideologues in the Senate want to turn what the Founding Fathers called the cooling saucer of democracy into a rubber stamp of dictatorship. They want it because they can't get their way. They want to wash away 200 years of history. They want to turn this country into a banana republic where if you can't get your way, you change the rules. It would be doomsday for democracy. Verbatim comments from Senator Chuck Schumer. What's changed? I was one of the 61 people that signed the letter after on 30 different occasions President Trump called for nuking the filibuster when he was in office. I signed that letter at a time when it was hard, but I did it because I care about the institution of the Senate and the thing that makes our body different from any other deliberative body in the world. 32 of my Democratic colleagues signed that same letter. 27 of them are still here. I would ask them what's changed. I would ask them if they agree with Chuck Schumer that doing so would turn us into a banana republic. We need to fight this and preserve the institution of the Senate. It's more important than any pressure that they could be getting from anyone, including the President today. And I would urge my colleagues to go back and reread that letter and ask themselves what's changed and protect the Senate.
Well, I think everybody here has heard the hypocrisy on the filibuster from previous statements by Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, and many, many who signed the 2017 letter. The Democrats' response, as we all know, is something along the arguments of this. Well, the legislative filibuster must be nuked, even though they've made statements otherwise, because American democracy must be saved from Republican state legislators and Republican members of Congress and their so-called Jim Crow 2.0 schemes. That's really the heart of the argument. There's an unstated and really, listen to them, an even stated moral superiority in their argument that on voting rights laws, Democrat states are doing good and Republican states are doing bad, even racist motives. So is that true? This is a really important question. Is that true? Now, I don't assume to know other states. And by the way, most of my colleagues don't know other states in terms of their laws. But I do know my state, the great state of Alaska. And here are the facts about my state, a Republican state, in 3 critical areas of voting rights. Critical: automatic voter registration, no excuse absentee voting, and early in-person voting. Alaska voting laws are significantly more expansive than voting laws in New York, in Delaware, in Connecticut, in New Hampshire, in Massachusetts, just to name a few. Those are the facts. So are those states Jim Crow 2.0 relative to my state? By Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer's reasoning, they are. So here's an important issue for all of you. The next time the president, which I'm sure he'll do today in Georgia, or Schumer or other Democratic senators preen with their moral superiority on the issue of voting rights as an excuse to nuke the filibuster, ask them this simple question: why can't their states measure up to a Republican state like Alaska on key voting rights issues?
Good morning, good afternoon. I oppose the voting rights H.R. 1 legislation and have spoken adamantly about my views on the Senate floor. I would highlight that the framers, the founders of our nation, through the Constitution, knew that voting rights were so important that constitutionally they gave the power to administer those laws to states across the country. It would be a terrible mistake for the nature of our democracy to federalize those laws. Today, I'm most concerned about the potential change in the rules of the United States Senate. The filibuster, which perhaps the word has a bad connotation, the ability for a member of the United States Senate to speak on behalf of his or her constituents, to advocate on their views, even though they may be in the minority, is what that 60-vote rule provides. So it protects the minority, not just the minority whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, but the minority of whether you're rural or urban or you have an unusual idea. It allows every senator to have the opportunity to garner more information, to seek out the sponsors of the bill, to have a conversation, to pull people together before we decide to proceed on legislation. It protects a member of the Senate who represents a minority view or needs additional information before agreeing to proceed. But it does more than that. It forces us to work together. I long for the days in which Republicans and Democrats, members of the United States Senate, regardless of political party, work with each other. The rule requiring us to pass legislation, to proceed to legislation by 60 votes, requires that. Secondly, it makes the ups and downs of an election, it evens them out. We saw the passage of a tax bill during the last Congress with a different administration, and an attempt to pass a new tax bill in this new Congress with a new administration. We're still figuring out what the old tax code says, and if we can change the laws, whatever they are, whatever the policy is, with the change of an election, then we create such uncertainty that it's difficult for people to predict what's going on in their lives, whether to buy a house now or is the tax law going to change. The uncertainty is damaging to our economy. It also is important that the filibuster remain in position because we need desperately for a Congress. Article 1 of the Constitution created a legislative branch, and because of the divisions that exist between parties within the Congress, we are unfulfilling. We are not fulfilling our responsibilities for one of the greatest threats to our liberties and freedoms that Constitution guarantees. Republicans and Democrats, members of the United States Senate, regardless of political party, should be working together to make sure that the legislative branch is the legislative branch and that we have not conceded. We have not ceded to the executive branch all the powers and authorities through executive orders and other mechanisms by which the executive branch now operates. Remember the days when Republicans and Democrats would band together in opposition to any administration, whether it was Republican or Democrat, intruding upon our authorities. That's missing today, and again, the filibuster should bring us together, not pull us apart, so that we can stand up for something the framers of the Constitution understood, that an executive branch, a president, regardless of what their intentions are and regardless of their political persuasion, continue to erode the powers of the people through the legislative branch. Freedoms and liberties are protected by process, by the Constitution and by the 60-vote rule in the United States Senate. In the absence of those, in the circumstance in which those are eroded, the personal freedoms of my constituents and all Americans are disappearing. Thank you.
First off, I've been up here 3 years, and the first thing I've learned is that if you're on the Senate floor, you don't have to remember what you said before. I mean, I've been shocked when I preside over the Senate where people get up there and they would say exactly the opposite that I knew that they had said before. And that's exactly what's going on here. This is not about elections. This is, well, it is about elections. It's only about Democrats win elections. It's not about improving elections. I'm from a state that we have early voting, we have absentee voting, you can vote on election day. We want to make sure people vote, but you shouldn't be able to violate the sacred right of voting. Nobody's vote should be diluted by somebody that doesn't have a right to vote. So we've talked about a lot of things that people have said. This is Joe Biden when he was in the Senate. The Senate ought to not act rashly by changing its rules to satisfy a strong-willed majority acting in the heat of the moment. That's exactly what this is. Chuck Schumer is scared to death of his primary. He's doing everything he can to make sure that AOC does not run against him. He's going to go as far to left as possible, and he's mad that he can't get this done with 50 votes. We're going to do everything we can to make sure the filibuster lasts because it's good for the American public.
Dissent within any legislative body is inconvenient. It's inefficient. Those who express differing viewpoints are a nuisance. And yet, we've seen that our own system of government has gone to great lengths to make sure that no one person and no one group of people can accumulate too much power, because we've seen the dangerous effects of that. We've understood that there are greater values than efficiency and lack of annoyance that people experience when there is disagreement and dissent. And for that very reason, our founding fathers set up a system of government that splits up power along two axes, vertical and horizontal. Along the vertical axis, we have federalism that says that most of the power is actually supposed to be left with the states and their political subdivisions. A few specific enumerated powers are given to the federal government. And then it also separates power along a horizontal axis. Within the federal government, we've got a branch that makes laws, a branch that enforces them, and a branch that interprets them. But within the legislative branch, our branch, it's split up even further. The House and the Senate. And then the Constitution goes on to say that each of those houses will have the ability to make their own rules. The Senate rules echo what's found in the Constitution. They echo it by making sure that no one group of people and no one person can accumulate too much power, even when they have a simple majority behind them. That's because so highly do we value dissent and the benefits that it brings to society that we want to protect it. So these Senate rules, while not directed by the Constitution themselves, were promulgated pursuant to constitutional authority, and they reflect the very same values. What the Democrats are trying to do right now is to undermine each of these things. They're undermining this principle of federalism, as I described it a minute ago, by taking powers that don't belong in the federal government, that do belong in the states, and thereby depriving the people of each state the ability to make their own laws as they deem fit. They're also trying to suppress the Senate rules, to undo them, because they're inconvenient, because dissent is difficult, and disagreement can be a nuisance. This is exactly why we need to stop them from doing this. Look, it's been noted a few times here that a number of us, most of us, stood up aggressively amid calls within our own party a few years ago to say no to nuking the filibuster, because it's not right. It's not something that's going to lead to a good outcome. Something that's going to lead again and again and again to a whiplash, a back and forth, further uncertainties in the status of the law if we were to undo the filibuster. And if we were to break the rules of the Senate in order to change the rules of the Senate simply because we couldn't get enough support to change them consistent with the Senate rules, we'd be doing great danger, not just to the Senate as an institution, but to the interests of the American people. They know that. What's so strong is their push and their desire to ram through a radical leftist agenda that they're willing to ignore these features of the Constitution and the interests that have come to be embodied in the United States Senate. Look at what we're facing today. In the House of Representatives, constituents can't even get in to see their elected representatives. They can't even get in there. And now in the Senate, they want to silence our dissent within that body and break the rules of the Senate in order to change it, in order to shove through bills that would fundamentally change the balance of power within our republic ordained and established by the U.S. Constitution. We've heard other material quoted from Senator Schumer. I'm not going to rehash the same quotes, but I am going to give you another quote that I don't think has been mentioned today and that hasn't gotten a lot of airtime, something that I think is especially poignant for our discussion today. Senator Schumer said that the filibuster was one of the, quote, checks and balances which have been at the core of this republic, checks and balances that say that if you get 51% of the vote, you don't get your way 100% of the time, close quote. That's especially telling here. He doesn't even have 51% of the votes in the Senate. This place is split 50 to 50. Look, he foretold that these checks would be evaporated by the nuclear option. He was right then. And he was right then to say that this is what we call an abuse of power. He should take his own advice, and he should stop this now.
The goal of our voting laws ought to be to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. He asked the American people what they think about our voting laws, particularly in the November election just passed. The Pew organization, a nonpartisan polling organization, polled the American people, and they said 94% of them said it was easy to vote. 94%. I dare say you can't find any other topic on which 94% of the American people agree. But they agree that 94% said it was easy to vote. So I asked Senator Schumer just now on the floor of the Senate, what provision of the state laws do you believe discriminates against people's access to the ballot? And he said, well, we can't harvest ballots. Ballot harvesting is a mechanism by which a political activist, say a campaign worker, can go to a place like a nursing home and assist the residents in filling out their ballots and then collect the ballots and then come provide them to the election clerk. As I described it, I think you can see the opportunities for fraud and mischief. And many states, some states allow ballot harvesting, but many states prohibit ballot harvesting. And the Democrats want to mandate ballot harvesting in all 50 states. They also, by the way, want to eliminate voter ID, which is one of the most broad bipartisan ballot integrity measures that exist. People have to use your ID for every other purpose you can imagine, and most Americans on a bipartisan basis believe you should be able to identify yourself with a photo ID in order to cast your ballot. Finally, I think Senator Moran made a really important point. We've talked a lot about the filibuster. Most Americans probably haven't thought about the filibuster much until this discussion. Maybe they still wonder what exactly it is and what purpose it serves. But the filibuster is designed for a very important purpose, and that is to ensure that we do something that doesn't come natural, which is we actually work together. It forces us to work together and build bipartisan consensus for good public policy. It also slows down the process and allows for fulsome debate so that anybody and everybody of whatever view they may have can contribute to the debate, and we can make good decisions that will endure. What really the Democrats are arguing for by blowing up the Senate rules is a purely partisan process by which our laws are passed, which, as others have pointed out, would change, let's say, in 2 years when there's a new majority. So there's a good public benefit to maintaining the 60-vote bipartisan requirement when it comes to passing legislation, and the Democrats are threatening to blow that up strictly for partisan political gain and no other reason. All right, time for a couple of questions.
I've got a question for the group, and then one maybe for you, John Klein, or for Senator Moran, to both address this point. For the group, since you all said it was so important, I'm just curious, how many of y'all would commit to not touching the 60-vote threshold in the next Senate should Republicans retain control and this Democratic effort not succeed?
Well, I think, I don't know that we have time for everybody to answer that. Well, it was very clear in the very immediate past where we were on this. I think Senator Tillis pointed out that when we controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House, that the Republican president on around 36 public occasions called on us to change this rule. We didn't change it. We signed letters at the time. We've had opportunities to do this in the immediate past, and I think, frankly, the opportunity to discuss the merits of having one of the two bodies of the Congress have a slightly more difficult way forward, it will be helpful in sustaining that in the future.
And then a question for you, Senator Corner and Senator Rain, because you both addressed this point. Talk about the filibuster as a tool that allows for debate, allows for the opportunity to work with the other side, come to consensus, come to agreement on things. But it doesn't require that. You can filibuster from your office and never talk to somebody who's putting forward something you're filibustering. Should it require you to have those kinds of conversations in some format, as you're saying it allows for?
Senator Corner?
Well, yes, there's a lot that happens here in the United States Senate that doesn't happen on the Senate floor. We're constantly talking to one another, eating meals with one another, talking to each other on the phone, sending text messages to each other. So there's a lot of different ways to communicate these days with your colleagues and to try to identify what the problems are that they have concerns about. You can hotline a bill. People can impose holds. Then it gives you an opportunity to identify who the senator is who has objections or changes that they want and to negotiate those. But yes, I think one of the most important things about the 60-vote bipartisan requirement is that it forces us to do something that doesn't come natural, but which I think the American people benefit from immensely by providing, by passing laws that will stand the test of time and enjoy broad support.
Senator Brand, do you want to add anything? Yes.
Senator, setting aside the 60-vote threshold, which I understand is a very touchy subject, I've had conversations with a number of senators over the years, including some who've spoken today, who are not happy with how the Senate operates. We hear that from both parties. Is there a circumstance where you think it would be appropriate to talk about the rules, the notion that there's fewer amendments voted on, that there's more one-person holds on nominees, all of these things that contribute to the frustration of individual senators? When and where can you talk about it, debate them?
Well, one, I think the senators are the problem, not the rules. Two, I also think if you're going to change the rules, that change should be focused on the long-term functioning of the Senate, not temporary partisan advantage. For instance, in 2016, when I was the chair of the Rules Committee, our whole conference had a conference discussion on the Republican side about would we generally be supportive of a rule change to take effect in the new Congress that would eliminate the 60-vote threshold to get on a bill. And we decided we would. I went to Senator Schumer, who was the ranking member of the Rules Committee. I said, here's a proposal we think would help if we got on bills, but we understand you'd be reluctant to do it now, so we're prepared to change the rules now to begin in the next Congress. When Democrats start making proposals like that, I think you'd have a reasonable reason to assume that they're interested in the long-term functioning of the Senate rather than the short-term advantage of the moment. And I don't hear any of that discussion going on. Yes.
Thanks, Senator. Are you making a distinction at all between the filibuster as a general 60-vote threshold and then carve-outs for specific issues? And if you all are committing now not to supporting any change in the filibuster, does that also mean not supporting any carve-outs whenever you may have to?
Well, on the topic of the carve-out, I agree with Senator Manchin on this. He says when you start carving the turkey, you eventually eat the whole turkey. I'm not sorry I'd say it exactly that way, but I think when you make one exception, then every other thing is suddenly not as important as that one exception. The federal government taking over state election laws, not as important as the environment. The federal government taking over state election laws, not as important as how you deal with the pandemic. I just don't think it works. Frankly, I think it's pretty hard in a parliamentary question to change it with a one exception anyway, and even if you could, I'm convinced that that exception wouldn't last, and that's exactly what Senator Manchin said last week, that he didn't think any exception would last, and I don't believe it would either. Maybe the last question. Yep.
One is just for Senator Cruz. I didn't see you raise your hand when asked if you would keep the 60 vote threshold. Should you be in power? Are you going to remain 60%?
Well, this is actually an issue on which I've changed my mind over the 10 years I've been here. When I first arrived, I was adamantly opposed to changing the filibuster. The last few years, I was one of the people on the Republican side who changed my mind and said I was open to changing the filibuster. Why? And what I said publicly is I said the reason I'm open to changing it is I think the Democrats, when they get power, will do this. They will ram it through. I've seen the radicals in their party, and I think they're going to ram it through. And if they're going to do it, I don't think it makes sense for only one side to do it and not the other. I can tell you I've had conversations over the last year with both Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema where I've told both of them, I said, listen, you guys maybe are in the process of proving me wrong, and I'd be very happy to be proven wrong if y'all don't ram this through. I think the world is a much better place with the filibuster, with protection of minority rights. I think turning the Senate into a place where the majority can trample the rights of the minority is a terrible outcome. And the reason I have gone back and forth on this particular issue is I've seen the rise of the radicals in the Democratic Party. And, you know, it speaks volumes. There were, 27 Democrats who signed this letter saying they wouldn't change the filibuster. I would encourage all the reporters here, every one of those 27 Democrats, you ought to be asking them today, are you a hypocrite? You signed it when the Republicans were in power. Do you only support minority rights when you're the minority? You ought to ask every one of those Democrats, do you agree with Chuck Schumer that ending the filibuster is doomsday for democracy? And if Manchin and Sinema hold, and I hope and pray that they do, it will protect this institution. And if the Democrats protect this institution, I think the Republicans should as well. And to be clear, we did. The Republicans had the White House, the Senate, the House. We had every ability to do exactly what Chuck Schumer wants to do right now, and the Republican Party didn't. This is a power grab, but it's not just a power grab. It's a power grab to enable a power grab. What Schumer wants to do it on is a takeover of elections. And, you know, it's interesting. The rhetoric the Democrats use on this is Jim Crow. You know, Jim Crow laws were written by elected Democrats, and they were designed to prevent the voters from voting Democrats out of office. That's what Schumer's trying to do today. This is Jim Crow 2.0 of Democrats once again trying to take away the ability of the voters to vote them out of office. It's wrong, and it's an abuse of power.
And then quickly, Senators, this is all really about the divide in our country right now and how you handle it. Our country's also divided over how to handle the coronavirus. And it's sort of a glaring visual that many of the reporters here have masks. You all don't have masks. I know it's a personal choice. I'm just interested in why you all decided to appear together without masks. And we do know the COVID is going around here in Capitol Hill, and we know that. So I'm just interested in your decision.
Well, listen, I think there's been wild hypocrisy from the Biden administration when it comes to COVID policies, whether mask mandates, where Joe Biden rightly said we shouldn't have mandates, whether vaccine mandates, where Joe Biden said we shouldn't have vaccine mandates. As far as I know, everyone here has been vaccinated, been double vaccinated, been boosted. And at some point, look, I do know Dr. Fauci's been all over the map on it. He said, yes mask, no mask. He said, oh, I lied to the American people because they couldn't handle it. You know, at some point, the American people ought to be able to exercise their own freedom and make their decision. If you want to wear a mask, God bless you. You can wear a mask for the rest of your life. That's your choice. But other people ought to be able to have the right and choice not to wear a mask. And by the way, on the question of hypocrisy, you just asked, you people at the podium are speaking without masks. Just once, I'd like to see a reporter say to Joe Biden when he stands at the damn podium in the White House without a mask, Mr. President, why aren't you wearing a mask? Just once, I'd like to see you say to Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, when she stands at the podium with no mask, Ms. Psaki, why don't you have a mask? The questions are only directed at one side, and I got to say the American people see the hypocrisy.
Thank you all.
Senator Blunt.